Professor Wes Morriston will offer comments.
We're indebted to Professor Swinburne for a highly nuanced and sophisticated account of the hermeneutical possibilities for dealing with problematic biblical texts. Here I shall concentrate exclusively on what he has to say about some of the morally problematic passages. I once heard a lay reader breeze straight through Psalm 137, not stopping at the appointed place, so that the congregation was treated to the final two verses. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy the one who pays you back for what you have done to us. Happy shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. I remember only one thing about the homily that morning. The preacher began by saying, "We were not fortunate in the choice of scripture for today." I left church thinking that if any part of the Bible could be discarded, this one was one we could surely let go. It seemed obvious to me that these words were written by someone whose heart was filled with resentment and hatred, who craved revenge, and who had no problem with killing innocent children to get it. However, Professor Swinburne thinks it's a mistake to emphasize what the human author of the text had on his mind. A text may be interpreted in different contexts and may have multiple meanings. In the case of the Bible, the most important of these is God's intended meaning. When we interpret texts like this one, we must take into account God's beliefs, insofar as these are known to us through settled Christian doctrine or through a careful reading of other biblical texts. When we do this in just the right way, even morally offensive passages may turn out to have a divinely intended and entirely wholesome meaning. It's at this point that Professor Swinburne appeals to the hermeneutical methods of the Church Fathers. Many of them felt free to read problematic texts in a metaphorical or allegorical way. Read that way, Psalm 137, verse 9, can be interpreted as a blessing on those who destroy their evil inclinations through the power of Christ. Several worries come to mind right away. First, it's hard to see Psalm 137, 9 as an effective way of communicating this message. It's only because we have other, less misleading words and deeds and metaphors and traditions of interpretation to work with that we can strain to find a benign meaning in this text. Why, then, would God inspire the inclusion of such potentially misleading and dangerous words in a work addressed to all human beings, very few of whom could be expected to understand them in their intended sense? Second, we've at best taken care of only part of the moral problem posed by Psalm 137. The verse about bashing little ones on a rock is immediately preceded by another that speaks of paying you back for what you did to us. Bitter resentment and revenge are unhealthy and morally subpar, to say nothing of the fact that they're wholly incompatible with the ideals embodied in the life and teachings of Jesus. There is nothing metaphorical about verse 8, and it is surely the proper context for interpreting verse 9. Third, it's not easy to see how divine inspiration is supposed to work in such a case. Does God inspire someone to write hate-filled words, intending that hundreds or thousands of years later, others will interpret them metaphorically? Professor Swinburne explains, "The doctrine," I'm quoting now, "the doctrine of divine inspiration is not committed to any view about which authors of any passage were inspired, those who wrote down the original pericope or those who incorporated it into some larger unit which would give it a different sense," unquote. Inspiration, it seems, can operate at different levels. Some of the smallest units may not have been inspired at all, and inspiration may have arrived only when someone included them in a whole capable of giving them the meaning God wanted them to have. But what about the Jewish exiles who were the first to encounter Psalm 137? Wouldn't they have been justified in hearing verse 9 in the naive, natural way? Professor Swinburne says not. At that very time, he points out, Jeremiah was writing a letter to the exiles in which he tells them in God's name to, quote, "Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare," unquote. Let's try to put ourselves into the shoes or the sandals of the Israelite exiles. We obviously haven't read the New Testament, and we can't take the rock metaphor, the rock featured in Psalm 137:9 as a metaphor for the power of Christ, but we're strongly under the impression that Jeremiah speaks for God. We've just read his letter, and we're about to sing Psalm 137. Naturally enough, we experience a certain cognitive dissonance. How to resolve it? Only one thing comes to my mind. God, through Jeremiah, must be saying, "Don't sing psalms like that. It was I who sent you into exile. The Babylonians were merely my chosen instrument. There is no blessing for those who take revenge on them." If that would have been a reasonable interpretation for the exiles in Babylon, why not for us today? Which takes us right back to my original position. Discard the obnoxious verses of that psalm. They don't speak for God. Now, Psalm 137, 8-9, is far from the only morally problematic passage in the Bible. Interestingly, Professor Swinburne does not give a metaphorical interpretation when he discusses other disturbing texts. For example, the claim in Exodus 20 that God visits the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation is directly contradicted by Ezekiel 18. But no attempt is made to restore consistency by finding a metaphor in the Exodus passage. The threat to punish later generations for the sins of their ancestors is explained as follows. What's true is only that later generations may suffer as a consequence of the sins of earlier ones. But in the period in which this part of Exodus was written, the ancient Israelites were a primitive people, incapable of understanding the subtle distinction between this true claim and the untrue claim that God would punish later generations for the sins of their fathers. So why did God create primitive people? Well, it's good for primitive people to have an opportunity to, quote, "work things out for themselves, even if they need and get quite a bit of help from God in due course." Now, I see no reason why the generation in question could not have understood the relevant distinction if it had been given to them, but suppose they could not have. What bearing does this have on the correct interpretation of Exodus? Is the suggestion that we, who can make the relevant distinction, should read Exodus 20, verse 5, as saying merely that evil befalling later generations is a natural consequence of the sins of earlier ones? That this is what God is telling us in the text? If so, then it seems to me that it would be much simpler just to say that Exodus got this particular thing wrong and that Ezekiel made the appropriate correction. What, finally, of the divinely mandated genocides? What about the war against the Canaanites? Some of the church fathers interpreted this as an allegory, with the Canaanites representing evils that must be conquered if we are to occupy the promised land of the kingdom of heaven. What has to be exterminated is our evil inclinations. In this paper, however, Professor Swinburne makes no use of such an interpretation. He reads the relevant passages as straightforward historical narratives. God really did command the extermination of these nations. He had a right to do so, he had good reasons for doing so, and the Israelites had an obligation to obey. As the creator of life, God has a right to take it, and if God commands someone else to do the job for him, that is his prerogative. In this case, God needed to preserve Israel from a lethal spiritual infection by the polytheism of the Canaanites, a religion which included child sacrifice and cultic prostitution. No doubt God could have accomplished the same thing by sending a plague to kill off the Canaanites, but he had a good reason for using the Israelites to do this job. Exterminating vast numbers of Canaanites, we're told, would bring home to the Israelites the enormous importance of worshiping and teaching their children to worship the God who had revealed himself to them and no other God. Professor Swinburne tries to weaken resistance to the idea that God commanded the ancient Israelites to practice genocide by drawing an analogy between physical and spiritual disease, and I quote, Even today, and without a divine command, many people would think it justified to kill people who had an infectious lethal disease and refused to be kept isolated from the rest of the population. Those who think that an infection which leads to spiritual death is as bad and evil as one which leads to natural death will think there are reasons, though not, of course, adequate reasons, for the Israelites to kill the Canaanites even without a divine command. I take it then that all that's needed to turn these inadequate reasons into adequate ones is a divine command. There's no way to cram into this short response everything that needs to be said here. I'll be able to gesture in the direction of just a few of the most important points. First, I'm not one of those who would think it right simply to kill people with a deadly infectious disease who won't voluntarily isolate themselves. I would have to be convinced that no less drastic measures were available, that the disease was terribly infectious, etc., conditions that do not apply to an omnipotent being. Second, I should think there's plenty of what Professor Swinburne would count as an infection which leads to spiritual death around today. And as far as I can see, the people suffering from it do little to isolate themselves from the rest of the population. So then, should we be open to the possibility of a divine command to exterminate, say, pimps and prostitutes? Or perhaps evangelical atheists of the Richard Dawkins type? I should think not. We would rightly treat anyone who said God had commanded him to kill Richard Dawkins as a madman. But then I see little reason to be open to the possibility that God commanded the ancient Israelites to exterminate men, women, children, and animals because their alien religious practices were an infection which might lead to spiritual death for the Israelites.